They say miracles don't happen in broad daylight on ordinary Tuesday afternoons, but nobody told that to 14-year-old Jenny Wade when she taped a handwritten sign to her mother's upright piano in the summer of 1967. The cardboard read, "Piano for sale, $140 or best offer," in shaky blue ink, and if you had driven past the modest house on Audubon Drive in Memphis that day, you probably wouldn't have given it a second glance. Just another family selling their belongings, just another story of hard times in a working-class neighborhood where dreams came cheap and bills came expensive. But what happened next would become the kind of story that gets whispered in Memphis diners and music shops for generations. The kind of story that makes you believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to put the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. Because standing in that driveway just 4 hours after Jenny set up her desperate little yard sale was the biggest star in the world, and he was about to do something that would prove why Elvis Presley wasn't just the king of rock and roll, but the king of something far more important. Jenny Wade had been staring at that piano for 3 weeks like it was a death sentence. It sat in the corner of their living room the way it always had, covered with the same lace doily her grandmother had crocheted, holding the same family photographs in cheap frames that showed better times. Her mother Margaret had played that piano every Sunday after church, filling their small house with hymns that made the neighbors stop whatever they were doing and just listen. Margaret Wade had a voice that could make angels jealous and fingers that danced across those keys like they were telling stories in a language only the soul could understand. She had dreams once, real dreams about Nashville and recording studios and her name on records that people would play on jukeboxes from Memphis to Mobile. But dreams don't pay for medicine, and they certainly don't pay for the kind of medical bills that pile up when cancer decides to move into your body like an unwanted tenant who refuses to leave. The piano had been silent for 6 months now, ever since Margaret's hands started shaking too badly to find the right keys, ever since the treatments left her so weak she could barely walk from the bedroom to the bathroom without needing to rest. Jenny's father had left when she was 7, just walked out one Saturday morning to buy cigarettes and never came back, which is the kind of cliché that stops being funny when it's your life. So it was just Jenny and her mother in that house, and now it was really just Jenny because Margaret spent most of her days sleeping or crying or pretending not to cry when she thought her daughter wasn't looking. The medical bills were stacked on the kitchen table like a tower of shame, each one stamped with red letters that screamed, "Final notice," and "Immediate payment required." Jenny had done the math in her notebook late at night when her mother was asleep, adding and subtracting and crossing out numbers until her pencil tore through the paper. They needed $800 by the end of the month or the hospital would stop the treatments, and if they stopped the treatments, well, Jenny didn't let herself think about what happened next. She had exactly $43 saved from babysitting the Henderson twins every Friday night, and her mother's wedding ring had been pawned 2 months ago for another $75. The piano was all they had left that was worth anything, and even then, $140 was probably wishful thinking for an upright Kimball that was older than Kennedy's presidency. The morning she decided to sell it, Jenny sat on the piano bench and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them down, too afraid of the sound breaking something inside her that was barely held together with teenage stubbornness and prayer. She remembered being 6 years old and sitting on her mother's lap while those same hands guided hers across a simple melody, remembered the way her mother's laugh sounded when Jenny hit a wrong note, warm and encouraging like sunshine after rain. She remembered Christmas carols and birthday songs and the lullaby her mother invented just for her that didn't have a name but felt like being wrapped in the safest blanket in the world. This piano wasn't just wood and strings and ivory keys worn smooth by years of use. It was every good memory she had, every moment when their little broken family felt whole, every piece of proof that they had been happy once and could maybe be happy again. And she was going to sell it to strangers for $140 because that's what you do when your mother is dying and you're 14 years old and nobody else is coming to save you. If you've ever been to Memphis in July, you know the heat doesn't just surround you, it becomes part of you, pressing down from a white sky that's too bright to look at directly. Jenny dragged the piano bench out to the driveway first, then went back for the card table where she arranged the few other items she hoped might sell. Some of her mother's costume jewelry that looked expensive if you didn't look too close, a set of china that was missing 3 plates, a table lamp with a base shaped like a mallard duck that had always been ugly but might be someone else's kind of ugly. The piano would have to stay inside until someone actually wanted to buy it, but she propped the front door open and positioned the sign where anyone driving by could see it clearly. By 10 in the morning, 3 people had stopped. The first was Mrs. Chen from 2 streets over who offered $50 and seemed offended when Jenny said no. The second was a young couple who looked at the piano the way you might look at a stray dog you're thinking about adopting, played a few notes that sounded like broken teeth, and left without saying anything. The third was a man in a suit who spent 20 minutes examining every inch of the piano like he was conducting surgery, then offered $90 and acted like he was doing her a favor. Jenny held firm at $140, even though her stomach was twisting itself into knots and a voice in her head kept screaming that $90 was better than nothing. By 2 in the afternoon, the heat had driven her back inside for a glass of water, and she was standing at the kitchen sink when she heard the car. It wasn't the engine that caught her attention, plenty of cars had driven past that day. It was the fact that this one slowed down, then stopped, idling in front of her house with that particular rumble that expensive engines make. Jenny wiped her hands on her shorts and walked back outside, squinting against the sun that turned everything into washed-out watercolors. The car was a black Cadillac, the kind that looked like it cost more than her house, and for a moment she thought maybe it was a doctor or a lawyer, someone important who had the wrong address. Then the driver's side door opened, and the world tilted sideways in the way it does when your brain can't process what your eyes are showing you. You have to understand that by 1967, Elvis Presley wasn't just famous, he was a force of nature, a phenomenon that transcended music and movies and entered the realm of mythology. He was the guy whose hips couldn't be shown on television because they were too dangerous, whose voice made girls scream and faint and forget their own names. He had been in the army, he had made movies in Hawaii and Mexico and places that sounded like paradise, and he lived in a mansion called Graceland that was just a few miles away but might as well have been on another planet for people like Jenny Wade. The idea that Elvis Presley would be standing in her driveway, wearing dark sunglasses and a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, was so absurd that for a full 5 seconds she just stood there with her mouth open like a fish pulled out of water. Then he smiled, that famous crooked smile that had launched a million dreams, and said in that voice that sounded like honey poured over gravel, "Afternoon, sweetheart. That piano for sale?" Now let me tell you something about Elvis Presley that the movies and the documentaries often miss. Yes, he was larger than life on stage, yes he moved like sin set to music, yes he had charisma that could light up Madison Square Garden. But up close, when it was just him and you and no cameras or screaming crowds, he had a gentleness that caught people off guard. He spoke softly, almost shyly, with those Memphis manners his mother Gladys had drilled into him from birth. He looked you in the eye when you talked, really looked at you, like what you were saying was the most important thing in the world right then. And that's what he did with Jenny, took off those sunglasses and gave her his full attention while she stammered something that was trying to be words but came out more like surprised noises. "Yes, sir," she finally managed. "Yes, sir, it's for sale, it's right inside, it's a good piano, it needs someone to play it." Her face was burning redder than the Mississippi sunset, and her heart was doing something that felt illegal in her chest. Elvis nodded, still smiling, and said, "Well, let's take a look then." "Mind if I come in?" Jenny led him through the front door, acutely aware that she hadn't vacuumed in 3 days and that there were dishes in the sink and that the whole house probably smelled like the chicken soup she'd tried to make for her mother last night. But Elvis didn't seem to notice or care. He walked straight to the piano like he was being pulled by invisible strings, ran one hand along the top with something like affection, then sat down on the bench that Jenny had dragged back inside. "This is a Kimball," he said, more to himself than to her. "My mama had one similar to this when I was growing up in Tupelo. Couldn't afford it really, but she worked extra shifts at the hospital so we could have music in the house." He played a few notes, a simple progression that somehow sounded better than anything Jenny had heard come out of that piano in years. Then he played something more complex, something that might have been a hymn or might have been a blues song or might have been both at the same time, and the sound filled the house the way her mother's playing used to, making everything feel less empty for just a moment. "You play?" Elvis asked, looking up at her with those eyes that the camera loved but could never quite capture the kindness in. Jenny shook her head. "My mama does. She still does, she just can't right now because she's sick." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and suddenly she was telling this stranger, this impossible famous stranger in her living room, about the cancer and the bills and the treatments and how she needed $140 by the end of the month or everything would fall apart worse than it already had. She told him about her mother's dreams of Nashville and how she used to play at the church and how she had a voice that made people cry in the best possible way. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, not the guidance counselor at school who asked too many questions, not the neighbors who brought casseroles with pitying smiles, not even God during the desperate prayers she whispered into her pillow at night. And Elvis just sat there and listened, his hands still resting on the keys, his face serious and thoughtful in the way that made him look older than his 32 years. When she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out a wallet that probably cost more than the piano. Jenny watched, confused, as he counted out bills, one after another, laying them on top of the piano in a neat stack. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140. He paused, looked at the stack, then added more. 200. 300. 500. 800. 1,000. He kept going until there were $1,500 bills sitting on her mother's piano, next to the photograph of Jenny's grandmother and the duck lamp she hadn't managed to sell. "That should cover the medical bills and then some," he said, pushing the money toward her. "For the piano." Jenny stared at the cash like it might disappear if she blinked, like this was a dream she was about to wake up from in her narrow bed with the flower sheets. But that's too much," she whispered. "It's only worth $140, maybe less. We can't." Elvis held up a hand, stopping her. "The piano's worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it, and I'm willing to pay $1,500. Fair deal?" But here's where the story takes a turn that makes it something more than just a rich man helping someone in need. Though that would have been enough, more than enough, a miracle in its own right. Elvis didn't arrange to have the piano moved. He didn't call someone to come pick it up later. He sat back down on the bench, adjusted his position, and started to play again, something soft and slow that sounded like a prayer set to music. "Your mama's not playing right now," he said, his fingers moving across the keys with the kind of easy confidence that comes from 10,000 hours of practice, but that doesn't mean the piano should stay silent. Music has a way of healing things that medicine can't touch. He played for maybe 10 minutes, filling that small house with something that felt like hope, like possibility, like the universe remembering that sometimes good people deserve good things. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and turned back to look at Jenny one more time. "You tell your mama that I heard her story," he said, "and you tell her that anyone who gave up their dreams so their daughter could have a better life is already a star in my book. You tell her the king of rock and roll said so, and you tell her to keep fighting because the world needs more people who can make music that matters." He was almost to his Cadillac when Jenny's voice finally worked again. "Wait," she called out, running into the driveway with the stack of bills clutched in her hand like a life preserver. "The piano, you paid for the piano, you have to take it." Elvis turned around, that smile back on his face, and shook his head. "I didn't buy the piano, honey. I bought your mama some more time, and that's worth a whole lot more than some old upright Kimball. You keep it, and when she gets better, you tell her to play something beautiful. Tell her to play something that'll make the angels jealous." Then he got in his car and drove away, back toward Graceland or wherever kings go when they're done performing miracles in driveways, leaving Jenny standing there in the Memphis heat with $1,500 in her hand and a piano in her house that suddenly felt like the most precious thing in the world. Margaret Wade got 4 more years after that day, 4 more years of watching her daughter grow into a young woman with strength enough for both of them, 4 more years of Sunday hymns on the piano that Elvis Presley didn't buy. The cancer came back eventually because cancer is like that, unconcerned with fairy tales and acts of kindness, but those 4 years were full in a way that the previous ones hadn't been. Jenny learned to play piano herself, taught by her mother's recovering hands, and years later she would play at her own daughter's wedding, a simple melody that didn't have a name but felt like being wrapped in the safest blanket in the world. She never sold that piano, not when she needed money for college, not when she needed a down payment on her first house, not when collectors offered thousands for the piano Elvis didn't buy. It sat in her living room for 60 years, accumulating photographs and memories and the kind of history that money can't purchase. A reminder that sometimes the universe does conspire to put the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. Elvis never told anyone about that afternoon, at least not publicly. It wasn't in his nature to broadcast his good deeds. He did hundreds of similar things throughout his life, buying cars for strangers, paying off people's mortgages, leaving enormous tips for waitresses who looked tired. He understood something fundamental about fame and fortune that many celebrities never grasp, that the whole point of having more than you need is being able to help people who have less than they need. He had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a house so small it barely qualified as a house, wearing clothes from church charity boxes and knowing the particular shame of being the kid whose lunch was whatever the school had left over. He never forgot that, never let success sand down those rough edges of memory that kept him connected to the people he came from. So when he saw that sign in a driveway, when he heard that story about a mother who sacrificed her dreams and a daughter willing to sacrifice her memories, he didn't see it as an opportunity for publicity or a tax write-off. He saw himself in that story, saw his own mother Gladys who worked herself to exhaustion so he could have a guitar, saw every family in America who was one emergency away from losing everything. The story eventually got out, the way these stories always do in a city like Memphis where everybody knows everybody and secrets have a half-life of about 6 weeks. Someone saw the Cadillac, someone else saw Elvis going into the house. The pieces came together in diners and barbershops and beauty parlors until it became part of the mythology of the man. But by then it didn't matter because the important thing had already happened. A mother got more time, a daughter kept her memories, and a piano stayed in a home where it belonged. That's the real story, not the celebrity intervention or the dramatic rescue, but the simple fact that kindness rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured or calculated. Jenny Wade grew up to be a nurse, spending 40 years taking care of other people's mothers, other people's daughters, paying forward a debt she could never repay. She told the story of that Tuesday afternoon to anyone who would listen, not to brag about meeting Elvis Presley, but to prove that good people still exist, that miracles still happen, that sometimes when you're at the absolute end of your rope and you can't see any way forward, the universe sends help in the form of a rock and roll star with a wallet full of $100 bills and a heart bigger than his fame. They say you should never meet your heroes because they'll inevitably disappoint you, but Jenny Wade would spend the rest of her life telling people that Elvis Presley was even better in person than he was on stage or screen. Not because he was more handsome or more charming or more talented, though he was all those things, but because he was kind in a way that mattered, kind in a way that changed trajectories and saved lives and proved that being the biggest star in the world meant nothing if you forgot to be human first. He could have driven past that yard sale. He could have sent an assistant with a check. He could have done 100 different things that would have been easier and less personal and more appropriate for someone of his status. But he didn't. He stopped, he listened, he sat at a piano in a stranger's living room and made music that sounded like hope, and then he gave far more than was asked without expecting anything in return. That's the definition of grace, and it's a lesson that the world still needs to learn over and over again. So if you ever find yourself in Memphis, if you ever drive down Audubon Drive past the house where Jenny Wade grew up, which is still there though it's been repainted and renovated and filled with different families living different lives, take a moment to remember that story. Remember that on one impossibly hot Tuesday in July 1967, the king of rock and roll proved that he was the king of something even more important. Remember that a 14-year-old girl tried to sell her mother's piano for $140, and instead got to keep it along with 4 more years of her mother's life and a story that would inspire thousands of people she'd never meet. Remember that sometimes the greatest performances happen off stage, in living rooms and driveways and quiet moments of connection between human beings who recognize suffering and respond with compassion. And remember that if you've got something to give, whether it's money or time or just attention, there's always someone out there who needs it more than you do, and giving it might just be the most important thing you ever do. Now I want you to do something for me before you go, and I promise this isn't just some YouTube algorithm trick, though I do appreciate every single one of you who've made it this far in the story. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that good people exist and that small acts of tremendous kindness can change entire lives, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell me about a time someone helped you when you needed it most, or about a time you were able to help someone else. Tell me what this story means to you. Tell me if you have your own Elvis miracle story. Tell me anything you want because your stories matter just as much as Jenny Wade's story matters. And while you're down there in the comments, hit that like button, not for me but because it helps other people find this story. And maybe someone out there needs to hear it today, needs to be reminded that the world isn't all medical bills and desperate yard sales and running out of options. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because I've got dozens more Elvis Presley stories like this one. Stories about the man behind the legend, the human being behind the spectacle, the guy who used his fame and fortune to make the world a little bit better, one person at a time. These aren't the stories you'll find in the official biographies or the Hollywood movies, but they're the stories that matter most. The ones that prove that greatness isn't measured in record sales or box office receipts but in moments of genuine connection and compassion. So comment, like, subscribe, and then go out there and be the kind of person who stops when they see someone struggling, who listens when someone tells their story, who gives more than is asked without expecting anything in return. Be the Elvis in someone else's story, because Lord knows we could use a few more kings of rock and roll who understand that the real crown isn't made of gold and jewels, but of all the lives you touch and all the people you help and all the kindness you put into a world that desperately needs more of it. The piano is still playing somewhere, and if you listen close enough, you can still hear the echo of that Tuesday afternoon when everything changed for one scared 14-year-old girl and her dying mother. And that echo sounds like hope, sounds like grace, sounds like the best parts of what it means to be human.